Richard walked away from the royal guard, his heart still pounding. He was embarrassed, but more than that, he was angry. How dare that guard humiliate him in front of all those people? He had only been having fun, at least that's what he told himself. He turned and looked back at the crowd. Some were still watching him, shaking their heads. Others were checking their phones, probably posting the video online. That made Richard's blood boil. He hated being laughed at. "No one makes a fool of me," he muttered under his breath. Instead of leaving, Richard made a bold decision. He wasn't going to walk away like a coward. He was going to show everyone that he was in control. He took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and marched right back toward the guard. The crowd gasped. "Is he serious?" Someone whispered. Richard stopped just inches away from the guard again. He glared at him, his face red with anger. "You think you're tough, huh?" he said in a low voice. "You think you can just stand there and scare people?" The guard, as always, didn't respond. His face remained calm, his body still like a statue, but his grip on his rifle remained firm. Richard smirked. "Let's see how tough you really are." Before anyone could stop him, he reached out and shoved the guard's shoulder. The crowd gasped again. People murmured nervously, knowing this was going too far. Still, the guard didn't move. He was trained for moments like this. He had faced far worse. But Richard wasn't done yet. "You're not so special," Richard sneered. "You're just a guy in a silly outfit, standing around doing nothing." Then, in a final act of arrogance, Richard did something no one expected. He raised his hand and slapped the guard's cheek. It wasn't a hard slap, but it was enough to cross the line. For a moment, everything was silent. The air felt heavy. The crowd couldn't believe what they had just seen. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The royal guard, who had remained still through all of Richard's insults, finally reacted. With perfect precision, he took a sharp step forward and raised his rifle. "Stand down," he commanded, his voice loud and powerful. The sudden movement caught Richard completely off guard. He stumbled back, his face turning pale. But the guard wasn't done. In one swift motion, he used the butt of his rifle to push Richard backward. It wasn't a hard strike, just enough force to send a clear message. Richard lost his balance and fell backward onto the pavement. His sunglasses flew off his face. His expensive suit was now covered in dust. The crowd erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped. One man burst out laughing. "That's what you get," he shouted. Richard sat on the ground, his face red with both anger and embarrassment. You can't do that," he stammered. "I'll have you fired. Do you know who I am?" The guard didn't respond. He simply returned to his position, standing tall and proud. His duty was done. But Richard's problems were just beginning. Phones were still recording. Videos were being shared, and soon, the entire world would know what had just happened. Richard sat on the ground, stunned. His expensive suit was dirty, his sunglasses lay broken beside him. And worst of all, everyone was staring at him. Some people were laughing, others were shaking their heads. His face turned red with anger. "You can't do that," he shouted at the royal guard. "I was just joking. You're not allowed to touch me." But the guard didn't move. He had returned to his position, standing tall and proud, as if nothing had happened. His face remained calm, his grip on his rifle firm. He had done his duty. He had defended himself and the honor of the royal guard. Richard scrambled to his feet, brushing the dust off his jacket. His hands were shaking, not just from embarrassment, but from the realization that he had lost control of the situation. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The crowd, however, was loving it. "That's karma," a woman said, shaking her head. "You mess around, and you find out." A man nearby chuckled. "Serves him right." Richard's eyes darted around. That's when he noticed something even worse. Almost everyone had their phones out, recording him. His stomach dropped. He knew how fast things spread on the internet. In a few minutes, this video could be all over social media. People would recognize him. His friends, his business partners, everyone would see this. No, 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 he muttered under his breath. In a panic, he turned to the crowd. Delete those videos, he demanded. You can't record me without my permission. But no one listened. In fact, some people laughed even harder. Oh, now you don't like attention. A young man smirked. Maybe you should have thought of that before you slapped a royal guard. Richard clenched his fists. He wasn't used to being treated this way. He was used to getting what he wanted, used to people respecting or fearing him because of his money and status. But now he was just a joke. Just then, a police officer arrived, drawn by the commotion. A tall man in a dark uniform with a serious expression. What's going on here? The officer asked, looking around. Before Richard could speak, several people pointed at him. This guy assaulted the guard, one woman said. He slapped him right in the face, another added. The officer frowned and turned to Richard. Is this true? Richard's confidence was gone. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He couldn't deny it. There was too much proof, too many witnesses, too many phones recording every second. I was just messing around, he finally mumbled. The officer crossed his arms. Messing around. You assaulted a member of the Royal Guard. That's a serious offense. Richard gulped. But, come with me, the officer said, stepping forward. Richard panicked. Wait, I didn't mean any harm. I'll apologize. The officer didn't care. You should have thought about that before you put your hands on him. The crowd cheered as the officer took Richard by the arm. Looks like karma came quick, someone shouted. As Richard was led away, he could still hear the laughter, still see the phones recording. He had come to London expecting respect and admiration. Instead, he was leaving with humiliation and regret. And worst of all, his downfall was just beginning. Richard walked behind the police officer, his face red with anger and embarrassment. The crowd was still watching him. Their phones pointed in his direction. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the weight of his actions was finally sinking in. This is ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. All of this over a little joke. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He had disrespected a royal guard. He had crossed the line, and now he was facing the consequences. The officer led Richard to the side, away from the palace gates. All right, he said firmly. What were you thinking, putting your hands on a royal guard? Richard huffed. I wasn't thinking, okay. It was just a joke. The officer didn't look amused. That joke could get you in serious trouble. These guards are here to protect the palace, not to be your entertainment. Richard looked away, still fuming. He hated being talked down to, especially in public. He was about to argue when he heard a voice behind him. Hey, officer, you should check online. Someone in the crowd called out. The officer turned, and a young man stepped forward, holding up his phone. This guy's already famous, he said with a smirk. The video of him slapping the guard is all over social media. Richard's stomach dropped. Wait, what? The officer took the phone and pressed play. Richard watched in horror as the video showed himself, smirking, mocking, then slapping the guard. And then, the best part, the moment the guard stepped forward and made him stumble back. The comments under the video were brutal. Instant karma. Serves him right. How entitled do you have to be to think you can slap a royal guard? Hope this guy gets what he deserves. The officer sighed and handed the phone back. Well, he said, crossing his arms, looks like the whole world knows what happened. Richard felt his face burn, his hands clenched into fists. He had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now he was just a viral joke. People around him were still watching, whispering, and laughing. Some were pretending to take selfies but were clearly recording him instead. Delete those videos, Richard snapped at the crowd. "You can't post that without my permission." A woman near him raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so now you care about rules." The crowd chuckled. Richard turned back to the officer, desperate. "Listen, I'll pay a fine or something, okay? Just make them stop sharing the video." The officer shook his head. "That's out of my hands. Once it's online, it's online." Richard's heart pounded. His whole life, he had built his reputation as a powerful, successful man. He had never been humiliated like this before. How would his friends react? His business partners? His family? He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. He opened his social media apps, and there it was. The video had already been shared thousands of times. His name was trending, and the comments were ruthless. His mind raced. What could he do? How could he fix this? But deep down, he already knew there was no escaping this, and things were only going to get worse. Richard stepped off the plane at Heathrow Airport with a proud smile on his face. He was finally in London, a city he had always wanted to visit. But for Richard, this trip wasn't just about sightseeing. It was about showing off. He believed he was better than most people and thought money could buy him respect. Dressed in an expensive suit and wearing dark sunglasses, Richard walked through the airport as if he owned the place. He ignored the polite "Welcome to London" signs and brushed past other travelers without a second thought. He didn't care about the people around him. To him, they were just background characters in his story. Outside, Richard hopped into a fancy black taxi. "Take me to the best hotel in the city," he told the driver. His voice was full of confidence, almost like a command. The taxi driver, an older man with a kind face, nodded and started driving. As they moved through the busy streets of London, Richard stared out of the window. He saw the famous red buses, the grand buildings, and the people walking quickly along the sidewalks. But instead of admiring the beauty of the city, he smirked. "Not as impressive as I thought," he muttered to himself. After checking into a luxurious hotel, Richard decided to explore the city. He visited fancy restaurants, took pictures of himself in front of landmarks, and spent money carelessly. But something was missing. He wanted more excitement, something that would make him feel powerful. That evening, Richard found himself near Buckingham Palace. He had seen pictures of the famous royal guards, the soldiers who stood completely still, no matter what happened around them. He had heard stories about how they never moved, never spoke, and never reacted to anything. To Richard, it seemed like a challenge. A small crowd had gathered near the palace gates, watching the guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. Tourists took pictures, some even trying to make the guards laugh. But the soldiers remained still, their faces serious and their eyes straight ahead. Richard smirked. "They're just standing there like statues," he said loudly. "Are they even real?" People around him glanced at him but didn't respond. They were there to enjoy the moment, not to cause trouble. But Richard didn't care. He wanted attention. He stepped closer to the guards, looking them up and down. That's when he noticed one particular guard, a tall, strong-looking man with dark skin. Richard's smirk widened. He had always believed he was better than others, and now he saw an opportunity to prove it. He pointed at the black royal guard and laughed. "I bet I could make this one move," he said loudly. His voice was full of arrogance. A few tourists looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. The guard, as expected, remained perfectly still, his eyes focused straight ahead. Richard moved even closer. He waved his hands in front of the guard's face, trying to make him blink, but the soldier didn't react. His training was too strong. He had learned to ignore distractions. But Richard wasn't done. He wanted to push further. He had no idea that his actions were about to lead to something he never expected. After the apology, Richard left the scene quickly. His head was down, and his heart was still racing. He couldn't believe how fast everything had gone wrong. Just a few hours ago, he had been a confident tourist, excited to visit one of the world's most famous landmarks. Now, he was a laughingstock. As he walked through the crowded streets, his phone buzzed again and again. It was impossible to ignore. He opened his messages, his hands trembling. A text from his business partner. "Richard, what happened in London? Your name is trending, and it's not for anything good. You better explain yourself fast." A call from his mother. "Richard, I just saw the news. What were you thinking? You've got a lot of explaining to do." And the worst part, the video. It was everywhere. On the news, on social media, even on TV. Richard's face was all over, his humiliation playing on a loop for millions of people. His reputation, built up over years of hard work, was being torn apart in front of his eyes. He tried to call his PR team. He needed someone to fix this, to turn the story around. But when the phone rang, no one answered. They were likely already overwhelmed by the flood of calls and messages about his incident. Richard slammed his phone down in frustration. He had never felt so helpless in his life. The people who once admired him were now mocking him. By the time he reached his hotel, his mind was spinning. He needed to figure out what to do next. Should he make a public statement? But what could he say? He had already apologized, and people didn't seem to care. They were too busy enjoying his downfall. He sat down on the bed, rubbing his temples. This wasn't just a small mistake. This was ruining his life. He thought about his friends, his colleagues, his future. Would they ever respect him again? There was a knock on the door. Richard stood up, hoping it was his PR team finally showing up to help him. But when he opened the door, he was met with something he wasn't expecting. It was the Royal Guard, or rather, a man dressed in the same uniform. "Who are you?" Richard asked, confused. The man smiled slightly. "I'm a friend of the guard you disrespected earlier. He asked me to come and talk to you." Richard blinked, surprised. "You've got to be kidding me. I've apologized already. What else do you want from me?" The man shook his head. "It's not about that." He paused. "It's about the message you send. You insulted him, sure, but more than that, you insulted what he stands for." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" The man stepped closer, his tone serious. "The Royal Guard is about respect. It's about duty, honor, and sacrifice. You mocked those things today. That's what people are angry about, not just the slap, but the disrespect. And if you don't learn from this, your life will never be the same." Richard stared at the man, unsure of how to respond. He had never thought about it that way. In his mind, he had been playing a joke, having a bit of fun. But now he realized how wrong he had been. "I didn't think about it like that," Richard said quietly. "I thought it was just a game. I never realized how much disrespect I was showing." The man nodded. "It's not just about one guard. It's about the values that make this country what it is. If you want people to respect you again, you need to show respect to others first." Richard swallowed hard. He felt like he had just learned something important, but it was too late to take it back. He had made a public fool of himself, and the damage was done. "Can you help me?" Richard asked. "Is there anything I can do to fix this?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked at Richard, as if thinking. Finally, he said, "It's not about fixing it right away. It's about changing how you live from now on. You need to show real humility and respect, not just for the guard, but for the people who are watching you. The apology you gave earlier wasn't enough. You need to prove you've learned something." Richard nodded slowly. He wasn't sure how he would do it, but he knew that the path forward was about more than just saving face. It was about rebuilding the respect he had lost. The man turned to leave, but before he did, he said one last thing. "You've got a long road ahead of you, but the choice is yours." Richard stood there in silence, letting the words sink in. He had a long way to go, and it all started with a choice. Richard stood in front of the Black Royal Guard, a smug look on his face. The other tourists watched in silence, some shaking their heads. They knew the guards had an important job, and no one should disturb them. But Richard didn't care. He thought this was all a joke. "Come on," he sneered, waving his hand in front of the guard's face again. "Not even a blink. Are you even real?" The royal guard remained still, his posture straight and unshaken. His eyes focused straight ahead, just like his training had taught him. He had seen people like Richard before, tourists who thought they were clever. But he knew his duty. He was there to protect the palace and uphold his country's honor. Richard laughed and turned to the crowd. "Look at this guy. He won't even move an inch. What's the point of standing there all day like a statue?" A woman in the crowd spoke up. "Leave him alone," she said firmly. "He's doing his job." Richard scoffed. "Doing his job? Just standing there. That's not a job. That's a joke." Some people in the crowd started murmuring, clearly uncomfortable. Others took out their phones, sensing that something might happen. Richard noticed them recording, and instead of backing down, he played up his act even more. He stepped even closer to the guard, invading his personal space. He moved his face just inches away and grinned. "What if I make this a little harder for you?" Richard reached out and poked the guard's chest. Nothing. He poked again, harder this time. Still, no reaction. The crowd gasped, and a man muttered, "He's really crossing the line now." Richard smirked, enjoying the attention. He had spent his whole life pushing people around, getting what he wanted. No one ever stood up to him because he was rich and powerful. He thought this situation would be no different. But he was wrong. Richard took it one step further. He raised his hand and gave the guard a light slap on the cheek. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to shock the crowd. A wave of silence fell over the scene. For a second, it felt like time had stopped. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The royal guard, who had remained motionless all this time, finally reacted. With lightning speed, he took a single step forward and raised his rifle, the bayonet pointing straight at Richard's chest. "Step back." The guard's deep voice rang out, firm and commanding. Richard's face turned pale. He stumbled backward, his cocky attitude vanishing in an instant. He had never expected the guard to move, let alone speak. His heart pounded in his chest. The crowd erupted. Some people clapped, others gasped in shock. The woman who had told Richard to stop earlier smirked. "Told you to leave him alone," she said. Richard's confidence was gone. He held up his hands and laughed nervously. "Whoa, no need for that. It was just a joke." But the guard's face was like stone. He didn't lower his weapon. His voice was calm but firm. "Disrespecting a royal guard is a serious offense. Leave now." Richard swallowed hard. He could feel the eyes of the entire crowd on him. People were still recording. His moment of fun had turned into a disaster. Humiliated and shaken, Richard turned and hurried away. But little did he know, his troubles were far from over. The videos were already spreading online, and soon the whole world would see what he had done. And karma was about to catch up with him. The days that followed were some of the hardest of Richard's life. The video of his encounter with the royal guard had gone viral, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. He couldn't escape it. Everywhere he went, people whispered or pointed at him. But as much as it stung, Richard knew it was his fault. He couldn't blame anyone but himself. He had let his pride get the best of him, and now he was paying the price. He spent the next few days in his hotel room, thinking. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could decide what to do next. The man who had visited him, one of the royal guard's friends, had left him with a lot to think about. Respect, duty, honor. These weren't just words. They were values that shaped the way people lived. And Richard had ignored them, thinking he could joke around and get away with it. But now he understood. He had to show that he had learned from this mistake. He couldn't just apologize once and move on. He had to prove that he had changed. Richard decided to make a public statement. It wasn't going to be easy, and he knew it might not fix everything. But it was the right thing to do. He needed to show the world that he had learned humility, that he understood the importance of respect, not just for the royal guard, but for everyone. He sat down in front of a camera in his hotel room, his mind racing. He had no script, no plan. He just had to speak from the heart. "Hello, everyone," Richard began, his voice steady but uncertain. "My name is Richard, and I'm sure you've all seen the video of what happened in London." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about that moment, and the way I acted. I want to say that I was wrong. Not just for slapping the guard, but for the way I treated him. I disrespected him, and I disrespected everything he stands for." He paused again, trying to find the right words. "I was arrogant. I thought I could do whatever I wanted because I had money and power, but that's not how the world works. It's not about what you have. It's about how you treat others. And I didn't treat that guard, or anyone else, how they deserve to be treated." Richard's heart was pounding. This wasn't easy. He had never been the type to show vulnerability. But if he was going to make this right, he had to be honest. "I want to apologize, not just to the guard, but to everyone who saw what happened. You didn't deserve to see that. And I'm sorry for anyone I hurt or offended. I promise that I will learn from this. I will be more humble, more respectful, and I will do better from now on." He stopped recording and sat back, his hands still trembling. He knew it wouldn't erase the damage, but it was a start. It was a way to show people that he wasn't just making excuses. He was truly sorry for what he had done. The video was posted online, and almost immediately, people began commenting. Some were still critical, but many others were impressed by his apology. "It takes guts to admit you were wrong. Respect. Glad to see he's taking responsibility. Hope he sticks to his word. We all make mistakes, but this is how you grow. Well done, Richard." Richard smiled at the positive comments. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was starting to rebuild his reputation. The next day, he reached out to the Royal Guard. He wanted to meet him in person to offer a true apology. The guard agreed, and they met outside the palace, in a quiet corner away from the crowds. Richard extended his hand. "I want to say again, I'm truly sorry for what I did. You didn't deserve that. I've learned my lesson, and I respect you and your duty." The guard nodded but didn't say much. "It's good to hear that. I hope you take this experience and use it to be better." Richard nodded back. "I will. Thank you for giving me a second chance." As they parted ways, Richard felt lighter. The road to redemption wouldn't be quick, but he was willing to walk it. He had learned the hard way that respect wasn't something you could take for granted. It had to be earned, and it had to be given. It wasn't about saving face. It was about becoming a better person. And Richard was ready to do just that. Richard's hands were shaking as he scrolled through his phone. The video was everywhere. News websites were picking up the story, influencers were reacting to it, and memes were being made at lightning speed. One post had a screenshot of him falling back with the caption, "When you mess around and find out." Another comment read, "Rich tourist thinks he owns the world, until reality slaps back." Richard felt sick. He had always cared about his image. He wanted people to see him as powerful and important. But now, people saw him as a fool, a bully, a joke. He tried to think, how could he fix this? Maybe he could deny it, claim the video was fake. But no, there were too many witnesses. Maybe he could apologize, say it was just a misunderstanding. But would anyone believe him now? His thoughts were interrupted by the police officer's firm voice. "Richard, we need to talk about what happens next." Richard looked up, his heart pounding. "Next? What do you mean?" The officer sighed. "You assaulted a royal guard. That's a serious offense. Normally, you could face arrest, fines, or even a ban from the country." Richard's mouth went dry. Wait, hold on," he stammered. "It was just a little slap. No real harm was done." The officer frowned. That little slap was still an attack on a government official. If the guard wanted to press charges, you'd be in real trouble. Richard's stomach dropped. Jail, a criminal record, getting banned from the UK. This was getting worse by the second. I can't get arrested, Richard said quickly. This is all a misunderstanding. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever it takes. The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded. That might be your best chance. Richard exhaled, trying to steady himself. Apologizing wasn't something he was used to. He had spent his whole life looking down on others, acting like he was better than them. Now he had to humble himself or face serious consequences. The officer turned to the Royal Guard, who still stood at attention, as disciplined as ever. Sir, would you like to press charges? The guard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slightly and locked eyes with Richard. Richard swallowed hard. For the first time, he really looked at the man he had mocked and slapped. This wasn't just some guard. This was a highly trained soldier, standing with honor, protecting his country. Richard realized now how foolish he had been. Finally, the guard spoke. His voice was calm but firm. I don't need to press charges. Richard felt a wave of relief wash over him. Maybe he could walk away from this without ruining his entire life. But the guard wasn't done. But he continued, an apology should be given. Not just to me, but to the people who respect this uniform. Richard hesitated. He hated apologizing, especially in public. But he knew he had no choice. He took a deep breath, turned to the guard, and bowed his head. I'm sorry for what I did. I was wrong to disrespect you and your duty. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Then someone whispered, well, at least he admitted it. The guard gave a small nod but said nothing else. He simply returned to his position, standing tall as ever. The officer turned to Richard. Now, I suggest you leave before you make things worse. Richard didn't argue. With his head low and his pride shattered, he walked away. But even as he left, he knew the internet wouldn't forget this moment anytime soon. And his reputation, it was already destroyed.